Pitt was right. The French were always looking for ways to destabilise Britain, and so they conspired with Jacobite plotters. George II's exiled rival, the pretender James Stuart, had a good blood claim to the British crown. But he'd been excluded for his Catholicism. This would-be King James III and his Jacobite supporters had been twiddling their thumbs in exile in Rome. But the French now threw them a lifeline: military backing to attempt a coup in Britain. On the 23rd of July, 1745, James III's son, Charles Edward Stuart, landed on the coast of Scotland and sounded the rallying cry. Charles, who was basically an Italian, was here to challenge George, a German, to the British throne. And here at the palace of Holyrood House is the man of the hour, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, aka the Young Pretender. Charles Stuart had been brought up in Rome, and he'd always been told that the British throne was rightfully his, if only he could go out and get it. This portrait is like a recruiting poster for the prince's supporters. He's saying here, your prince needs you. And what a dashing and handsome young prince he is. He's looking very martial in his armour. He's looking very official and respectable in his blue sash of the Order of the Garter. But on top of that, he's wearing the green ribbon with the Cross of St. Andrews of the Order of the Thistle, the Scottish order. And this is designed to appeal to his richest source of potential support, the Scots. The Stuarts had been Scottish kings long before they'd inherited the English throne in the 17th century. And many Scots, particularly in the Highlands, rallied to Charles Stuart's cause. George II's popularity was at a low point. His decision to go on fighting that war with the Austrian succession was seen as a pointless drain on British resources. It was mainly the old Protestant dislike and mistrust of Catholicism that was keeping King George II on the throne and the exiled Stuarts off it. Edinburgh should have been a stronghold for George II, but with a sword in one hand and a cross in the other, the Young Pretender simply strolled with his forces into the Scottish capital and took control. He got a riotous reception, particularly from two sections of the crowd. Firstly, the so-called common people, and secondly, the ladies. All the women got out their handkerchiefs and threw them into the street in front of him. And it was on this occasion that a new nickname was heard for Charles Stuart. People were shouting out for Bonnie Prince Charlie. By now, Charles Stuart had got together an army of between 11,000 and 14,000 troops. His advisors encouraged him to seize the hour, to march on London to take the big prize, the British throne. Charles Stuart set up government here at the Palace of Holyrood House for 5 weeks. While he was here, he issued the Declaration of King James on behalf of his exiled father. This declaration appealed very cleverly to the self-interest of the British. It said that their German kings had been involving them in irrelevant foreign wars, wasting their resources, disrupting trade, and anyway, nobody wants to be ruled by a foreigner. You can see how this touched a nerve amongst Prince Frederick's group of patriots. Charles Stuart was being rather clever here. He knew that running down Hanover would appeal to the British public. Indeed, Sir Robert Walpole, when he was Prime Minister, had remarked that they would have been better off making Charles Stuart Elector of Hanover, because the public will never fetch another king from there. During the weeks of Charles Stuart's advance south into England, tensions mounted in the Georgian court. George II, bursting for a fight as usual, was ready to get on his horse and lead the charge. Instead, though, his younger son, the rotund Duke of Cumberland, was hurriedly brought back from the war with the Austrian succession and sent north to face the Jacobite threat. There was no love lost between the sons of George II. That's Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and his younger brother, the Duke of Cumberland. They really were chalk and cheese. Frederick was thin and liked music, whereas Cumberland was as fat as a Cumberland sausage, and he was a career soldier. Frederick was right to worry about the threat his younger brother represented. George II had even talked about a plan where Frederick would be shuffled out of the line of succession and given Hanover as a consolation prize, and the crown of Great Britain would be placed firmly on the head of the king's favourite son, Cumberland, instead. Cumberland now marched north for a showdown with the Jacobite army at Carlisle Castle. Meanwhile, his brother Frederick had Carlisle Castle recreated in spun sugar for a rather quirky dinner party rebellion. The Duke of Cumberland had liberated the city of Carlisle from the Jacobites. But Frederick wasn't very impressed by this. He decided to make a mockery out of it. One day for dessert, he ordered a model of the citadel of Carlisle to be made out of sugar. And after dinner, he bombarded it with sugar plums. Now, this must have been quite hilarious for Frederick's guests, and it may seem a little bit trivial. But actually, members of the royal family couldn't come right out and openly criticise each other. They had to express their opinions obliquely. And that's why their politics could be expressed through things like their puddings. Frederick was also making a bigger humanitarian point. He was a gentler character than his brother, and abhorred Cumberland's brutal approach to warfare. As Charles Stuart and the Jacobites retreated back north into Scotland, the Duke of Cumberland was beginning to pursue them with real ferocity. The struggle for the British throne came to a head here at Culloden, a battlefield that would become a byword for cruelty and bloodshed. This was the last battle ever to be fought on British soil. It was to be decided by two men in their 20s. Bonnie Prince Charlie was 25, and Cumberland's 25th birthday was the day before the battle. Kate Hurd, Royal Collection Trust's senior curator of prints and drawings, believes this watercolour is the closest we have to a visual first-hand account of Culloden. This picture sort of takes us to a ringside seat at the battle, doesn't it? How was the artist able to do that?
We know that the artist was at the battle. He was working for the Duke of Cumberland as one of his draftsmen and surveyors, so we know that he was an eyewitness to the battle.
Well, it looks like this side are winning because they're always all coming forwards, but that's not actually what's happening, is it?
No, you're absolutely right in that they are appearing to advance. They are advancing. It's the Jacobite troops on the right. They are doing this Highland Charge, which is their characteristic means of fighting. And it had been very successful for them. They'd won the Battle of Prestonpans just earlier in the same manner. But what they are facing is devastating fire from the government troops.
They've got better guns.
They've got better guns, and they've loaded them with canister shot, which scatters shot across the field.
There's the Duke of Cumberland sitting there watching. Was he a good commander, do you think?
He had a lot to prove at this point. He'd recently suffered a really humiliating defeat against the French on the continent at the Battle of Fontenoy, and he'd come to deal with the Jacobite threat. We know that he sent spies to the Jacobite camp the night before, so he was forewarned of what was about to happen. And he also had the advantage in that the Jacobites had attempted a night raid which had failed, so the soldiers were tired in a way that his soldiers weren't.
It's very distressing, actually, because you've got all of these poor Highlanders running forwards with what looks like a pitchfork in his hand, and these guys are just shooting cannons at them.
It was clearly a horrific battle, a great sort of toll.
But there was another factor in the fall of the Jacobites. They'd been abandoned by their French allies. Things were now going well for the French on the continent. They no longer needed to employ diversionary tactics in Scotland. I met Dr. Tony Pollard, a battlefield historian, who believes that Bonnie Prince Charlie didn't have any choice but to turn and face Cumberland's forces. Tony, why did Bonnie Prince Charlie have to stand and fight here, or why did he feel that he had to?
There are a number of reasons, really. For the Jacobites, it's a last roll of the dice, and the option is either to fight here or disappear into the mountains and basically fight a guerrilla war.
Wouldn't they have been really good at that?
I'm sure they would have been, given the Highland backbone to the army, but the thing is that Charles is a prince, and princes do not fight guerrilla wars.
It's a matter of masculine pride.
There's very much a matter of pride.
So, Bonnie Prince Charlie has his last great gamble. It fails. Just how bad was the defeat?
For him personally, it seems to have been catastrophic. He can't deal with the fact that this was it. But there are still men out there desperate to continue the fight, but he doesn't want to. And he disappears off into the heather famously. And so the Jacobite cause bleeds to death on Culloden Moor.
What sort of reprisals did Cumberland start to take then? This is where things get very nasty.
Almost as soon as the gunsmoke has cleared, the reprisals on the field begin. And wounded Jacobites are executed, men are taken away and imprisoned temporarily, then executed. Civilians are kept away from the battlefield. So it beggars belief what might have gone on here.
Now, some people have used the words ethnic cleansing to talk about these atrocities. Do you think that that's fair?
Very much so. There is a concerted campaign, particularly in the Highlands, basically to wreak havoc and to take revenge. And there are some terrible stories. And Cumberland himself, at one point, wanted to exile most of the population of the Highlands to the Americas so they couldn't cause more trouble. So it's an understandable response to these events.
Mass killings and mass graves. Unspeakable atrocities were witnessed at Culloden. And in Scotland, the Duke is still known as Butcher Cumberland. Back in London, though, he was feted as the man who'd saved Britain. Handel's oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, including the words, "See the conquering hero comes," was composed in his honour and rang out at St. Paul's Cathedral. King George II had finally vanquished the Stuart threat. A visitor to his crowded court reported, "I never saw anyone in such glee as the king." You could also buy a little bit of the Hanoverian victory to take home with you in the form of these commemorative medals in gold or silver celebrating the Duke of Cumberland. And this is such a divisive image, isn't it? To the Hanoverian supporters in London, they would have seen here a conquering hero, a fine figure of a man. But if you show this image of the Duke with his jowls to a Scottish person, even today, they're likely to spit on it. And the Hanoverians weren't done with the Highlanders yet. George II got Parliament to pass the Dress Act that made it illegal to wear tartan and banned the bagpipes. Frederick disagreed with this heavy-handed treatment, but again he displayed his rebellion in quite a cunning way. He commissioned a painting of his son, the future George III, containing a coded message. People at the time thought that there was something very strange about this picture. It was painted only months after the Battle of Culloden, and yet the little boy is wearing tartan. This could have been family politics. This is Frederick and his children having a go at Frederick's brother, the Duke of Cumberland, the victor of Culloden. Maybe Frederick is saying, I have some sympathy for the vanquished Jacobites. And I'd like to think that this is Frederick trying to assimilate the style of the Scots back into Great Britain. It would eventually work very well. Tartan would become a symbol of romanticism rather than rebellion. Myth and romance swirl around our image of the brave Scots with their pitchforks being cut down by a high-tech army. In reality, though, Scotland was just as sophisticated a society as England. The Jacobites may have been in love with the past, wanting to turn back time to the days when kings had divine right. But Scotland also boasted more progressive people, such as a group of new thinkers who were much more interested in shaping the future, the men of the Scottish Enlightenment. From poetry to pathology, Enlightenment thinking flowed out into all sorts of channels, including architecture. Those behind it thought that their future lay within the Union. So a competition to create a whole new quarter of Edinburgh was won by a design that featured a Union flag. George Street links the grand thoroughfares of Hanover Street and Frederick Street. But just why did the Scottish capital teem with innovation? The answer was education, and education, and education. By 1750, the Scots were the most literate nation in Europe. 75% of them knew how to read. And they also had 5 universities, as opposed to just 2 in England. At the Scottish universities, the fees were relatively low, and the social mix was relatively broad. Scottish people like to joke that there were the same number of universities in the whole of England as there were in just the city of Aberdeen. There was also a practical bent to education in Scotland. Poor but ambitious Scots, armed with useful skills, found plenty of opportunity abroad, in Britain's trade networks and new colonies. The Scots had failed to beat the English, so now it seemed like time to join them and make a profit. Professor Tom Devine believes that while the English ruled Britain's colonies, the Scots actually ran them. What were the practical effects of the Scottish Enlightenment when these well-educated Scottish people were going abroad to sort of practice it in other countries?
The impact is significant across the Atlantic in the mid to late 18th century period, because these new colonies, the North American colonies, what became the USA, is looking for ideas. It's looking, for example, a kind of intellectual toolkit, from European thinking in order to build up its institutions virtually from scratch, and to a significant degree it gets them from Scotia. The most remarkable example was what was called the College of New Jersey, better known now as Princeton. Princeton was the seminary for the first generation of statesmen in the USA, and Princeton's president was John Witherspoon, a Scottish cleric of the Enlightenment period.
Do you think it's fair to say that the Scottish Enlightenment was a sort of engine driving the expansion of the British Empire?
Well, it certainly was in terms of thinking, and it certainly was in terms of the tremendous regard that during the Enlightenment Scotland developed for almost a reverence for learning. And that was very important, because not all immigrants into the empire in this period were literate. Scots had this particular advantage of literacy and numeracy. I mean, don't forget, you get Scottish stereotypes aplenty. The Scottish doctor, the Scottish physician, the Scottish engineer, beam me up, Scotty.
So you've got these intelligent, well-educated, rational, commercially successful Scots.
And greedy.
But they're not making their own society fairer. Oh no, they're going off across the world to get rich elsewhere.
But it's important to recognise that among this range of influences, if you like, the intellectual engine of Enlightenment, I would argue the primary engine is materialistic. That the reason why Scottish doctors went in their large numbers to the Caribbean was not simply to study disease or to provide support or healing. It was to make lots and lots of filthy lucre.